Picture this: a snowy January night in a quiet Massachusetts town. A respected Boston police officer lies motionless on a front lawn. His girlfriend claims she accidentally struck him with her car. But what if everything she's been told is a lie? What if the people sworn to protect and serve were the ones with blood on their hands? Today, we're diving into one of the most controversial cases in recent memory. A case that exposed corruption, sparked nationwide outrage, and left everyone asking the same question: who really killed John O'Keefe? Canton, Massachusetts, January 29, 2022. It's the kind of small town where everyone knows everyone, especially if you're part of the tight-knit law enforcement community. And for 46-year-old Boston police officer John O'Keefe, this community was his second family. John wasn't just any cop. He was a 16-year veteran of the force, well-respected, well-liked, and known for his dedication to the job. But John had another side to him. He was a devoted guardian to his niece and nephew, two young children who had lost their parents and found stability in Uncle John's care. On that cold January evening, John was looking forward to a night out with his girlfriend of 2 years, Karen Reed. At 44, Karen was an accomplished professional. She worked in finance and seemed to have her life together. But beneath the surface, their relationship was complicated, marked by the kind of passionate highs and devastating lows that would soon become crucial to understanding what happened that night. The plan was simple. They'd attend a house party at 34 Fairview Road, the home of Brian Albert, a fellow Boston police officer. It was supposed to be a casual gathering among friends and colleagues. Little did anyone know that this house party would become the center of one of the most explosive criminal cases Massachusetts had seen in years. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Karen and John had been drinking that evening, first at a local bar, then continuing at Karen's house before heading to the party. Security footage would later show them at the Waterfall Bar and Grill were there. Body language suggested tension. Witnesses recalled heated discussions, raised voices, and the kind of argument that makes other patrons uncomfortable. What were they fighting about? The details remain murky, but sources close to the couple suggested it involved John's increasing concerns about Karen's drinking and her growing jealousy over his relationships with other women. Some say Karen had discovered text messages that made her suspicious. Others claim John was reconsidering their future together. By the time they left the bar, the temperature had dropped below freezing, and snow was beginning to fall. Karen was behind the wheel of her black Lexus SUV, a decision that would haunt her for years to come. But here's what makes this case so intriguing. What happened next depends entirely on who you believe. According to Karen's initial account, they arrived at the Albert house around 12:30 a.m. But John, she claimed, decided he didn't want to go in. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he was still upset from their earlier argument. Or maybe he sensed something was off about the gathering. Karen says she dropped him off at the curb and drove home alone, assuming John would get a ride back later or call her when he was ready to leave. But that's not what happened. Instead, John O'Keefe was found approximately 6 hours later, lying unconscious in the snow on the Albert family's front lawn. He had suffered severe head trauma and was rushed to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead a short time later. The scene was devastating. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to serving others, who had stepped up to raise his young niece and nephew, lying broken in the snow. The medical examiner would later determine that John had died from blunt force trauma to the head and hypothermia from exposure to the freezing temperatures. For the Canton Police Department and the Massachusetts State Police, this seemed like a straightforward case. They had a clear narrative. Karen Reed, John's girlfriend, had been drinking heavily. She was upset after their argument. She dropped him off at the party, but in her intoxicated and emotional state, she struck him with her vehicle as she was leaving. Whether it was intentional or accidental would be for the courts to decide, but the evidence seemed clear. Corinne's Lexus had damage to the front end and a cracked taillight. There were traces of what appeared to be blood and hair on the vehicle. Her phone records showed she had made numerous calls to John throughout the early morning hours, growing increasingly frantic when he didn't answer. To investigators, this looked like guilt and panic. But Corinne Reed maintained her innocence from the very beginning. She insisted she had simply dropped John off and driven home. She had no memory of hitting anything or anyone. The damage to her car, she claimed, must have happened some other way. And as the investigation progressed, her supporters would argue that this wasn't just denial, it was the truth. Because what investigators didn't initially consider was the possibility that John O'Keefe never made it inside the Albert house at all. What if he was attacked before he could reach the front door? What if the people inside that house, people who were supposed to be his friends and colleagues, knew more about what happened than they were letting on? As news of the investigation spread through Canton and the greater Boston area, something unexpected began to happen. People started asking questions. Social media users began dissecting every detail of the case, pointing out inconsistencies in the official narrative. And slowly, a counter-theory began to emerge, one that would turn this case from a simple vehicular homicide into a complex web of conspiracy, cover-up, and corruption. The question wasn't just who killed John O'Keefe anymore. It was whether an entire system, the police, the district attorney's office, the medical examiner, had conspired to frame an innocent woman for a crime she didn't commit. As the Massachusetts State Police dug deeper into their case against Karen Reid, something strange began to happen. The more evidence they collected, the more questions arose. And these weren't just minor inconsistencies. They were glaring holes in the prosecution's theory that would eventually expose what many believed to be one of the most brazen cover-ups in recent legal history. Let's start with the scene itself. When police arrived at 34 Fairview Road that morning, they found John O'Keefe's body on the front lawn. But here's what's bizarre. Despite lying in the snow for hours during an active snowstorm, there was no snow on his body. How is that possible? If John had been struck by Corinne's vehicle around 12:30 a.m. and lay there until 6 a.m., wouldn't he have been covered by the falling snow? But that's just the beginning. The medical examiner concluded that John died from blunt force trauma to behead and hypothermia. However, the injuries themselves told a confusing story. John had 2 black eyes, facial abrasions, and a massive head wound on the back right side of his skull. But here's what doesn't make sense. If he was struck by a vehicle, where were the typical injuries you'd expect to see? Where were the broken bones, the internal injuries, the pattern of trauma consistent with being hit by an SUV? Instead, John's injuries looked more like he had been in a fight. His knuckles were scraped and bloodied, suggesting he had struck something or someone. There were defensive wounds on his arms. And most puzzling of all, there were what appeared to be bite marks and scratches on his arm. Injuries that the prosecution would later claim came from Corinne's fingernails. But which defense? Experts would argue looked more like they came from an animal. An animal. Let that sink in for a moment. Because the Albert family owned a German shepherd named Chloe, a large, aggressive dog that several witnesses later claimed had a history of biting people. Now, let's talk about the Albert house itself, because this is where the story gets really interesting. Brian Albert wasn't just any police officer. He was well connected within the Canton Police Department and had relationships throughout the Massachusetts law enforcement community. His house at 34 Fairview Road was a regular gathering spot for local cops and their families. On the night John O'Keefe died, there were several people inside that house. Brian Albert and his wife Nicole were there, of course. But so was Brian's brother Kevin Albert, who was also a Canton police officer. Also present was Kevin's son, Colin Albert, a young man in his 20s, and Julie Nagel, Brian Albert's sister-in-law. Here's where things get suspicious. In the days following John's death, several of these individuals hired criminal defense attorneys. Why would innocent witnesses to a tragic accident need lawyers? And why were their stories about what happened that night so vague and inconsistent? According to the people inside the house, John never came in. They claimed they never saw him, never heard from him, and had no idea he was outside on their lawn until police arrived the next morning. But phone records and witness statements would later reveal a very different picture. Multiple people reported seeing John's phone ping off cell towers near the Albert house throughout the night, suggesting he was in the area for much longer than Karen's supposed quick drop-off. Video surveillance from nearby homes showed unusual activity around the Albert property in the early morning hours. Cars coming and going, lights turning on and off, and what appeared to be people moving around outside. But perhaps most damning of all was what happened to the physical evidence. Within days of John's death, Brian Albert had his basement floor completely renovated, removing and replacing concrete sections where blood or other evidence might have been found. He also sold his house and moved his family to a different state. Why would someone make such drastic changes to their life unless they had something to hide? And then there was the dog. Chloe, the German Shepherd, was rehomed to a relative inn another state almost immediately after John's death. When defense investigators later tried to examine the animal for evidence, DNA, behavioral patterns, anything that might support their theory, they discovered the dog had been euthanized. Coincidence? The defense team didn't think so. As these details began to emerge, a different narrative started to take shape. What if John O'Keefe did go inside the Albert house that night? What if there was some kind of confrontation? Maybe over money, maybe over a woman, maybe over something else entirely? What if John ended up in a fight with one or more of the men inside? What if the dog attacked him during the struggle? And what if, when they realized John was seriously injured or dead, the people inside that house made a calculated decision to cover it up? What if they moved his body outside, staged the scene to make it look like a vehicular accident, and then worked together to point the finger at Karen Reed? It would be a bold plan, but it might just work. After all, these were law enforcement. Officers who understood how investigations worked, who had connections throughout the police department and district attorney's office, and who knew exactly how to manipulate evidence and witness statements. The beauty of framing Karen was that she made such a perfect suspect. She had been drinking that night. She and John had been arguing. She was the last person known to be with him. And crucially, she was an outsider, not part of the tight-knit law enforcement community that protected its own. But the conspirators, if that's what they were, made one crucial mistake. They underestimated the power of social media and public scrutiny. As details of the case became public, amateur investigators began picking apart every aspect of the prosecution's theory. True crime enthusiasts created detailed timelines, analyzed phone records, and identified inconsistencies that professional investigators had either missed or chosen to ignore. The case became a sensation on platforms like TikTok, where the hashtag Karen Reed generated millions of views. Supporters organized rallies and fundraisers. They hired billboard trucks to drive around Canton and Boston, displaying messages like "Free Karen Reed" and "Who really killed John O'Keefe?" The pressure was working. As the defense team prepared for trial, they uncovered evidence that would shock even the most cynical observers. Phone records showing that key witnesses had been in contact with each other immediately after John's death, apparently coordinating their stories. Surveillance footage that contradicted official timelines. And perhaps most explosive of all, allegations that the lead investigator on the case had been having an affair with one of the key witnesses. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate the nation and expose the dark underbelly of small-town corruption. But would justice prevail, or would the conspiracy succeed in destroying an innocent woman's life? When the trial of Karen Reed finally began in April 2024, it had already become one of the most watched criminal cases in Massachusetts history. The courthouse in Dedham was packed daily with supporters, protesters, and media from around the country. But nothing could have prepared anyone for the bombshells that would explode during the proceedings. The prosecution's case seemed straightforward on the surface. They painted Karen as a jealous, alcoholic woman who had killed her boyfriend in a fit of rage. They presented evidence of the damage to her Lexus, the traces of DNA found on the vehicle, and Karen's own frantic phone calls that night. Lead prosecutor Adam Lally argued that this was a classic case of domestic violence escalating to murder. But the defense, led by attorney David Yannetti, had been preparing for this moment for over 2 years. And what they revealed in that courtroom would shake the Massachusetts justice system to its core. First came the forensic evidence that the prosecution didn't want you to see. Independent accident reconstruction experts testified that John O'Keefe's injuries were completely inconsistent with being struck by a vehicle. The pattern of trauma, they argued, looked exactly like what you'd expect from a beating, followed by a dog attack. Dr. Marie Russell, a forensic pathologist hired by the defense, presented graphic but crucial testimony about John's wounds. Scratches and marks on his arm, she testified, were consistent with bite marks from a large dog. The absence of typical vehicular trauma, no broken bones below the waist, no tire marks, no pattern of injuries suggesting impact with a bumper, all pointed to John never having been struck by Karen's SUV at all. But the real bombshell came when the defense revealed the prosecution's secret. The lead investigator, Michael Proctor, had been sending text messages about Karen throughout the investigation. These weren't professional communications about evidence or procedure. These were vile, misogynistic messages mocking Karen's appearance, making crude jokes about searching her home, and expressing clear bias against her. In one particularly damaging text, Proctor referred to Karen using language so offensive it couldn't be repeated in court. In another, he joked about not finding any nude selfies during the search of her phone. This was the man responsible for gathering evidence in a murder case, and he was treating it like a personal vendetta. The defense didn't stop there. They revealed that Proctor was friends with several members of the Albert family on social media, that he had failed to properly secure the crime scene, and that crucial evidence had been either lost or destroyed under suspicious circumstances. Remember Brian Albert's basement renovation? The defense presented evidence that chunks of concrete from that basement had been thrown away before they could be tested for John's DNA. The family's German shepherd, Chloe, had been euthanized before she could be examined for evidence of attacking John, and multiple electronic devices belonging to the Albert family had been either wiped clean or conveniently lost during the investigation. Perhaps most shocking of all was the testimony about what really happened inside 34 Fairview Road. That night, the defense presented evidence suggesting that Colin Albert, Brian's nephew, had been involved in an altercation with John O'Keefe. Phone records showed that Colin and his friends had been making frantic calls to each other in the hours after John's death. Witnesses testified that Colin had injuries to his hands in the days following the incident, injuries that could have come from a fight. The defense theory was explosive. John O'Keefe had gone inside the Albert house, gotten into a confrontation with Colin Albert and possibly others, been beaten unconscious, attacked by the family dog, and then had his body moved outside to stage a vehicular accident scene. The people inside the house then worked together to cover up what had happened, using their connections in law enforcement to ensure the investigation focused solely on Karen Red Dot. As the trial progressed, public opinion shifted dramatically. The hashtag Free Karen Read trended nationally. Supporters gathered outside the courthouse daily, holding signs and chanting. Even people who had initially believed in Karen's guilt began to question the prosecution's case. The prosecution tried to fight back. They argued that the defense was spinning elaborate conspiracy theories to distract from simple facts. Karen was drunk, she was angry, and she killed her boyfriend. They presented evidence of Karen's drinking that night, her contentious relationship with John, and the physical evidence linking her vehicle to his death. But by then, too much had been exposed. The jury had seen the biased investigation, the destroyed evidence, the suspicious behavior of the Albert family, and the complete lack of forensic evidence supporting a vehicular homicide. When the prosecution rested their case, many legal experts believed they had failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense didn't even need to put Karen on the stand. The prosecution's own witnesses had done enough damage to their case. The investigation had been so compromised, so clearly biased, that any reasonable juror would have to question everything about it. After weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: hung. They could not reach a unanimous decision on the most serious charges against Karen Read. The judge declared a mistrial, and Karen walked out of that courthouse a free woman, at least for now. But the story doesn't end there. The district attorney's office announced they would retry Karen Read, despite the massive holes exposed in their case. As of now, she remains charged with murder, though many legal experts believe a conviction is highly unlikely, given everything that has been revealed. More importantly, the case has sparked broader questions about corruption in Massachusetts law enforcement. The FBI has reportedly opened investigations into the Canton Police Department and the state police handling of the case. Several officers have been placed on administrative leave, and calls for reform of the state's police oversight system have grown louder. For John O'Keefe's family, the case remains a tragedy without closure. They continue to believe Karen Read killed their beloved John, and they've criticized the media circus surrounding the trial. But for Karen's supporters, this case represents something much larger. Proof that even in America, innocent people can be framed by corrupt systems, and that sometimes it takes an army of ordinary citizens to expose the truth. The Karen Read case has become more than just a murder trial. It's become a symbol of the fight against corruption, a testament to the power of social media to challenge official narratives, and a reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of fighting its way to the surface. Whether Karen Read is ultimately convicted or exonerated, one thing is certain: this case has exposed a level of corruption and misconduct that will have consequences for years to come. And for everyone who followed this case, one question remains: if they could frame Karen Read so easily, how many other innocent people are sitting in prison because they didn't have an army of supporters fighting for them? The truth about what happened to John O'Keefe on that snowy night in Canton may never be fully known. But thanks to the courage of a few determined investigators and the power of public scrutiny, we now know that the official story was built on lies, corruption, and a conspiracy that went all the way to the top. In the end, the real crime wasn't just what happened to John O'Keefe. It was what the system tried to do to Karen Read, and that's a story that should terrify anyone who believes in justice.